Good morning, class. Today we're going to look at the road to war and the start of World War II. So you should be able to define key terms associated with Hitler's European aggression and describe European leaders' response to Hitler prior to World War II. So we're going to look at Europe principally today. How did the end of World War I lead to World War II? What does that teach us? Well, the fact that the end of World War I led to World War II, just like the end of the Franco-Prussian War led to the First World War, shows us that if you want to avoid a war, you need to be very careful about how you end the last one. So, the Treaty of Versailles led to World War II for four principal reasons. First of all, as you know, reparations crash the economy. Germany does recover, but then the Great Depression again crashes the economy. But the initial economic crash through the reparations is what Hitler can harp on as being the mistreatment of the Germans by the Allies, the lack of respect that the rest of the world is giving to Germany, and this deep-seated sense of indignation, frustration, and having been wronged. Second, there is national shame at having to take the full blame for World War I, even though, as we've discussed, Germany was not fully to blame for World War I. It wasn't even the first country to declare war. And then third, the national shame at having restrictions placed on its army. So we didn't talk specifically about this with the Treaty of Versailles, but the German people additionally had regulations placed on what they could do with their army even inside their own borders. So France was quite intent that the area known as the Rhineland, so not only did they take Alsace-Lorraine back for the French, but the area of the Rhineland, which borders French territory, should be demilitarized, meaning no military weapons, troops should be stationed there. This would give France more notice if Germany were to attack it, because they could see the mobilization inside the country before they would actually be on the border with France. And then finally, the treatment by the Allied powers, because Germany was winning World War I before it agreed to come to the table. Again, the United States entering the war tipped the scales, and Germany would have lost, but it could have dragged that war out for another year, maybe 18 months, causing a lot more damage and deaths, and it chose not to, and it came to the table in good faith to negotiate a treaty, and then was blackballed from the negotiations and had a treaty forced down its throat, really, because it was either sign the treaty with these unilateral, unfair provisions, or we go back to war and the U.S. is on our side, so therefore you will lose. This gives rise to what we've already talked about with the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back theory, where Germany supposedly lost the war because of internal betrayal, as the only possible explanation for what happened, because again, the German people didn't see this loss coming. So, when Hitler comes to power, he's going to have three key demands on the international stage. Again, unlike Mussolini, he's not so intent to play by international rules. And so his three key demands, as marked on the map, 1, 2, and 3, are as follows. First, he wants to remilitarize the Rhineland. Second, he wants what's called Anschluss, or annexing Austria. Right? So Austria is a Germanic-speaking area, and so he wants to unite and add that territory to Germany. And then third, he wants what's called the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland is this red territory inside Czechoslovakia where the people there speak German. And then he wants to turn the rest of Czechoslovakia into a protectorate, which is essentially a puppet state for Germany. So here we need to talk about a vocabulary word called appeasement. Appeasement is the policy of bowing to another's demands in order to avoid confrontation. So concession, placation, pacification, giving in to avoid a conflict. If you give the last cookie to your younger brother to avoid a total tantrum and meltdown, that is appeasing your younger brother. Right? You're giving in to just avoid something that's more undesirable. At this time, democratic European leaders, former Allied powers, were often seen as having been very short-sighted, cowardly, and foolhardy in hindsight for giving in to Hitler at this time. So we're going to look at the kind of decision-making they underwent. And at the time, public reception was mixed. You have a lot of people who are going to hail these leaders as being peacemakers and avoiding another world war, which the people did not want. But then you will also have people like, for example, Dr. Seuss, who drew this cartoon, which very clearly is a critique of these appeasers. So we have in the center the appeaser, if you can read that there. And he's talking to this multi-headed hydra of Nazis. So there's your Marvel reference for today. And he's saying, remember, one more lollipop and then you all go home. So he's handing out these treats, and supposedly they should go back home when he's given each one a treat. But from the looks on their faces, the predatory stance that they've taken, it looks like they're probably not. And the appeaser is just deluding himself in thinking that this will satisfy this hungry beast. Again, a clear parallel for in the center, this is going to be a man named Neville Chamberlain, who we will talk about in a couple slides. And of course, the rest of this being Nazi Germany. But let's look at whether or not this is a fair critique of these politicians at the time. Are these demands truly unreasonable? If you put yourself in the position of the political leaders of this era, and remember, you have the recent memory of the catastrophic World War I, then the Spanish flu pandemic, then you're in the middle of the Great Depression. Fighting another world war is not something you want. And when you look at what Hitler's demanding, it's understandable that you could rationalize these not being so egregious. For example, remilitarizing the Rhineland. He's asking to put troops back in his own territory, and the principle of doing what you want inside your territory, which is known as sovereignty, is still the guiding principle of international law. And so the idea that he should be able to put troops in his own territory, one could understand that. I mean, it's been 10 years or a little bit more than 10 years since the end of World War I. Tempers have kind of simmered, and it doesn't seem worth picking a fight over what somebody wants to do inside their own territory from the perspective of these other countries. The Anschluss, well, Austria does speak German. They share a lot of culture with the Germans. They're a Germanic people. Germany came together along the lines of nationality and nationalism, as did Italy and several other territories. So this doesn't seem so crazy a demand to make. Of course, one should be a little concerned. The bigger Germany gets, the more powerful it can be. As we recall from the Congress of Vienna, the whole point was to keep Germany divided because we were worried about a large central power being able to take over continental Europe, as Napoleon had done. But human memories are often short, and again, we're looking to avoid another war. And then finally, the Sudetenland. Well, again, we have a German-speaking population, so one could rationalize adding that to Germany itself. Perhaps they are at a disadvantage inside the Czech majority, Slovak majority in the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then Hitler would regularly refer to Czechoslovakia as the dagger pointed at the heart of Germany. And so turning Czechoslovakia into a protectorate, this is a tougher sell, but Hitler's going to argue that his people need what's called Lebensraum, or living. Leben is life and living. Raum, room, living room, living space. This is a call that we saw the French and the British argue for why they were going to build their empires around the world, not necessarily in Europe, but in Africa, in India, in Australia. And it's a call we saw the Germans use also in Namibia when the genocides against the Herero, the Nama, and the San took place. So this isn't a new call by any means, and it's not something that's just unique to the German population at this time either. So for better or for worse, the Europeans, leaders at the time, they're looking at Hitler again through the eyes of what they remember about Mussolini, which is a fascist leader, certainly not pleasant to live under inside the country, but somebody who doesn't seem intent on going to war. at least not immediately. And so that's what they're expecting from Hitler, who's following in Mussolini's footsteps. And Hitler, we know in hindsight, clearly is bent on world domination and war, but it is understandable to see how the other democratic leaders in Europe were blinded, sort of willfully wanting to believe in Hitler's promises that, well, if you just give me the Rhineland, if you just give me the Anschluss, if you just give me the Sudetenland, then I promise I won't ask for anything more. And so it is this that leads to what we call the Munich Agreement. This is an agreement in 1938 between Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain and Hitler, at this point known as the Führer, or the leader of Germany. This formally allows Hitler to annex parts of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. In this meeting, notably, the Czechoslovakians and the Soviets are not invited to the summit where this is discussed, because obviously the Czechoslovakians are not going to be on board with this agreement, and nor will the USSR, because the USSR, like the Czechoslovakians, are a Slavic people. They see Czechoslovakia as kind of a little brother, and so they would not have signed on to this either. As a communist state, the British are not particularly inclined to listen to the Soviets anyway, so not inviting them, given these facts, is not at all surprising. I'm not saying it's right, but it's not surprising. Hitler promises that this will be the last thing he asks for, that he will keep within these new borders and not cause any trouble. And so this agreement is lauded as an absolute victory for peace. Neville Chamberlain is quoted as having said, "We've achieved peace in our time." Too much fanfare. So another pop culture reference from Avengers Age of Ultron, when Tony Stark is saying that he thinks Ultron will achieve peace in our time. That's a red flag to anybody watching that movie who knows this history, that things are about to go quite wrong. But let's watch Neville Chamberlain and the people's reaction to his announcement of this Munich Agreement.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
So again, from that you can see the popular reaction at the time, being very relieved and thrilled to avoid another war. We can look here at the League of Nations, which is supposed to be protecting countries from one another and be a place of peaceful negotiation, so it should have had Czechoslovakia's back. At the same time, we've mentioned how Japan is expanding an empire on the other side of the world in the Pacific, and it invades into Manchuria, even further into Chinese territory in 1931. The League of Nations, this is 7 years before the Munich Agreement, the League of Nations had said, hey, you can't do that. And Japan just quit. They said, well, then fine, we don't care. And they declare war against China by 1937. You could look at the invasion of Manchuria as a declaration of war, but they're certainly, without a doubt, at war with China by 1937. And then You have the Munich Agreement, which again, the League of Nations fails to stand up and protect Czechoslovakia. They do the same when Italy invades Abyssinia, Ethiopia, in 1935. I mean, if Japan could get away with invading a country by just quitting the League of Nations, then why not Italy? And Hitler's going to do the same thing. So the Treaty of Versailles, which not only stoked German anger in its punitive parts, but it also creates this League of Nations that is powerless in the face of a powerful country just choosing to openly and willfully disobey its orders. So the point here is that the League of Nations was a nice try. It was a first attempt at a United Nations, but it is ineffective in protecting smaller countries when the larger countries just don't want to listen. So let's look at how this war is going to shape up. The Axis versus the Allied powers, and why these are the sides. So, as I'm sure you know, okay, we have on one side Great Britain, the USSR, and the United States. You'll notice only 48 stars here because Hawaii and Alaska are not yet states. And on the other side, the Axis, we've got Nazi Germany. This is the war banner. The flag of Italy, and of course the Japanese imperial flag with the rays of the sun reaching out as it conquers and expands its empire. The Allied powers are really allies in response to the Axis powers. So the fact that these three team up is why these three team up. It's not necessarily that the USSR and the USA and Great Britain have a whole lot in common. Again, here we have a communist state and two capitalist states that are not happy at the existence of this communist state. But it's a principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So since the enemy of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan will be the USSR, and they will also be Great Britain and the United States enemies, these guys team up on this side. Okay. So that brings the question of why are the Axis powers allied? Well, what do they have in common? Oh, there you go. What do they have in common? Well, fascism, right? But of course, this similar government type includes extreme nationalism, so really they should not get along. And the Germans and the Japanese certainly have a rocky relationship. The Japanese feel superior to the Germans and vice versa, often looking down on one another. And the Germans definitely look down on the Italians, who will wind up needing their military assistance, the Italians. They're also industrialized and as a result in need of resources, and they are not rich in resources. So they have that in common. They're late to the empire building game. They're late to unification. They're late to industrialization. Well, Germany's been industrialized for a while, but they aren't rich in resources. And so they're going to be expanding and looking to build colonies. And that is why you're going to see a strategic alliance between Germany over here and Japan in particular, because as these countries expand, they can actually kind of help one another. If Japan attacks in French Indochina down here, the French are going to need to redirect supplies and troops to defend that territory, which means France will be more vulnerable to German invasion. And vice versa. Once Germany invades, say, Russia, then Japan will be able to more easily attack Russia because a lot of its focus will be on its western border, which is closer to Moscow and its major cities. So they're able to kind of play the allies off of one another, or divide their attention is really what I should say. They're able to kind of divide the allies' attention by attacking from two different sides here, the Pacific, the Atlantic. What draws the United States into the war? We don't have colonies here, certainly, to be attacked, but we do have the Philippines. And so, as you know, the United States has been building an empire into the Pacific, including the Philippines and a Hawaiian naval base that acts as a stopping off point and a jumping off point for activities in the Pacific, be it trade or military engagements. And so we've talked about how Japan will attack Pearl Harbor and draw the United States into the war. And we will talk more about that when that actually happens in a later lesson. So, if we're looking at the map, the United States is over here, a quote-unquote sleeping giant, not yet involved in 1938. You've got Germany and you've got Japan, and they're both expanding. And the next big target, the place that most people expect the next war to take place, is with the USSR. So the USSR, right, has a lot of resources, oil, land, etc., and massive ideological differences. The USSR is communist, and the other two are fascist. Now, again, for the United States, for Americans generally through today, they often do not see the difference between communism and fascism. Here we have a Simpsons cartoon with just a general bad guy, fascists, the Nazis, and then the communists, the hammer and sickle. And it's a joke because these things don't actually go together, but for most Americans, it's interchangeable. Because again, we fought against the fascists in World War II, and then we will fight against the communists in the Cold War. Both of them have totalitarian governments, even though, again, communists are not supposed to have totalitarian governments, but that's what we always see develop when it comes to countries, entire countries that are communist. Not necessarily work your own factories, but big countries tend to turn totalitarian. So to the United States, to the American imagination, these are interchangeable, but they're really not. The fascist attitude towards equality, very hierarchical and nationalistic. They don't believe people are equal, not at all. Whereas for communists, yes, everybody's supposed to be equal. It doesn't matter your sex, your race, your religion, your location in the world. Everybody is supposed to be equal. So those are in stark contrast, in opposition to one another. The scope of this philosophy. For fascists, this is a nationalistic. It's really focused on your group of people. Yes, it's expansionist, but it's expansionist for resources. It's not meant to incorporate the world's population. It's meant to conquer the rest of the world. Whereas for communists, they want the whole world to turn communist and live in this communist utopia together, again, as free and equal people, working together, workers owning the means of production, and having control over their lives. For fascism, the kind of government, the type of economy and the way the government interacts with the economy, we've talked about on our left to right kind of spectrum. We've got the fascists all the way on the right, where they're fully market capitalists. The business leaders are in control of the economy. And for the communists, it's the opposite. It's a command economy. Again, not what Marx planned, but this is what we see. A command economy where the government controls the economy. And we've talked about how, though that seems similar, though the government and the economy are closely intertwined, that leads to directly opposite types of policies. Here you get cars with seatbelts to protect the people. Here you get cars with no seatbelts to make the bottom line, the profit better for the business owners. So, Germany, Japan, and Russia should be mortal enemies. Germany and Japan versus Russia. Which is why people are expecting the next war to be between Germany and Japan and Russia. So it's a pretty huge shock when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is signed. This is named after the two leaders who signed this agreement, Molotov from the Soviets and Ribbentrop from Germany. It's also known as the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. It's signed in August of 1939. And this is where each of those countries promises not to attack one another. This is a peace deal. This is shocking. Around the world, fascists feel betrayed. How could Hitler sign an agreement with the scum of the earth, a communist dictator? And communists around the world feel betrayed. How could Stalin sign an agreement with a fascist dictator? They stand for the complete opposite things. How could they make this sort of agreement? And here we have a nice cartoon showing Hitler greeting Stalin, the scum of the earth, I believe, and Stalin lifting his cap saying, the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. So clearly this is a tense peace deal. And here you will notice there is a body lying between the two of them. And so what is the purpose of this pact? What does Hitler seek to gain? Because eventually he will betray Stalin. He will attack the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, 2 years later. Stalin will not see this coming, and having just purged a third of his officer corps during the Great Purges, he will lose significant ground at the start of that war. But Stalin trusts Hitler, and Hitler's willing to do this because it gets him something he wants. And that, if you look at the map, what do you think it is that these two leaders will both be going after? This political cartoon, I think, highlights it nicely. What are they both standing on? Right on top of Poland. And so this is the start of World War II, where Germany will invade Poland on September 1st, 1939, mere weeks after signing that, well, really a week after signing that agreement with the Soviet Union. Because remember, the creation of Poland, it had not existed for a while, and they brought it back, and the Treaty of Versailles is a buffer between the Soviet territory and German territory. And Hitler no longer needs to worry that if they invade Poland, which is what he wants to do, that the Soviets will see that as an aggressive attack and attack in return. Now the Germans are free to invade Poland. Initially, Germany makes demands about getting Danzig, the German-speaking city, and a corridor to East Prussia. Because if you remember, back here, this bit here is Germany, and so is this. And so Hitler's saying he wants a corridor connecting his country with the other part of his country. This may not seem so outlandish, but remember, the rest of Europe has already given in to three major demands, and he had promised that Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland was the last time he was going to ask for something. So that was where the line had been drawn, and now he's asking for something else. And the League of Nations and the other countries say nope, and so he invades Danzig, he invades Poland, and can rest assured that Russia will not, so the Soviet Union will not counterattack. In fact, the Soviet Union will invade from the other side, and they will divide Poland in half. Well, 2/3 and a third. A third to the Soviets and roughly 2/3 to the Germans. The British and French declare war on Germany 2 days later. That this is a line too far. You have to stop with Poland. Or you can't take Poland. You had to stop with the Czechoslovakians. The invasion, the type of German warfare, is known as Blitzkrieg. Blitz means lightning. This is where Donner and Blitzen, the reindeer, get their names. Donner is thunder, Blitzen is lightning. Blitz means lightning, and Krieg means war. So Blitzkrieg is lightning war. The Germans are going to invade with massive air support and tanks, and they are going to roll through Poland in just over a month. The Polish put up a valiant effort, but they are under-industrialized, and their military, they are taking tanks, they're taking the cavalry against German tanks. And so they fight bravely, but they really didn't stand much of a chance. And again, the Soviets are going to be coming in from the east. So Blitzkrieg, this is different than World War I. It's hugely different. This is a fast 1-2 punch. First, you fly over with an aerial assault, followed by rapid ground invasion led by armored tanks. You knock them out before you know what hit them. And it's born out of necessity. Germany cannot handle a trench war, a protracted war. Tanks have made trenches obsolete, but even just a protracted ground war, Germany doesn't have the supplies, right? The whole reason they're looking for this quote-unquote Lebensraum and these additional territories is to take resources, because they don't have enough. So they're going to concentrate their resources into highly effective weapons and then hope that they can get far enough to take more of the resources they need. For example, when Germany invades North Africa and Stalingrad, they're going to go after oil supplies because tanks need oil, planes need gasoline, which is made from oil. So this is why Germany keenly invests in technological advances and a small division of the most advanced tanks on the planet. The United States will outproduce, once we get involved in the war, we will outproduce German tanks, 7-1, I believe. But the German tanks will be far superior. But we will just overwhelm them because, again, the Germans just don't have the resources. Okay, that is the start of World War II. Tune in next time to see how it turns out.